Let's talk about when British Army infantry officers abandoned the sword and revolver. Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. Now, we've spoken quite a lot on this channel about the sword and revolver used by British officers right the way through certainly the second half of the 19th century, and pistol and sword before that. And how they were abandoned pretty much in the First World War. I'm just going to put this revolver down and I'm going to sheath my sword. Now, first thing you will notice is I'm wearing a Sam Browne belt and my sword is being worn in a so-called field service scabbard. So this was pretty much standard equipment at the beginning of World War I. Now, when we talk on this channel and other similar channels about weapons being superseded, changed, abandoned, whatever, because of the nature of what we're interested in, that is weapons, we tend to focus and fixate on the effectiveness of those weapons. But that's not always where the answer to the question lies. Most people are quick to assume that the rifle with attached bayonet is simply a more effective weapon than the sword and revolver, or certainly than the sword, and people make a direct comparison, an unfair comparison, between guns and swords, and that's never really been what the whole debate is about. It's not about guns versus swords, because you have to remember, of course, that we're comparing here, we're not comparing like with like. We could actually compare bayonet with sword, or we could compare rifle with pistol or revolver, indeed. But of course, those things are used in different ways, in different circumstances, and obviously a rifle isn't a direct comparison with a pistol or revolver either. Now, before we get really into the meat of this topic, one thing we have to concede is that this is the weapon set of the infantryman, of the private soldier, and indeed, by this period, the NCO as well. Whereas the sword and the pistol or revolver is very much the symbolic weapon set of the officer. And before we go into this topic, we have to get that into our heads and ask why. Why is that so? Well, most people watching this channel will know that a sword is the symbol of the officer, and their thinking kind of stops there, okay? But it's more practical than that, in fact. Okay, there is a reason, not just to do with the fact that the officer is also a gentleman, and gentlemen wore swords and duelled with swords and pistols as well, and these are emblems of a gentlemanly class. It's not only that. It is also a practical thing as well. And one thing you have to realise is that an officer is not the same as his fighting men. He is an officer. He is a leader. His job is to lead. The officer's job is not necessarily to be firing upon the enemy himself, but it is to be coordinating his troops and organising them and leading them by example, motivating them and everything else. So his weapon set has a very different set of requirements and a very different context to those weapons of his men. His men's weapons are primarily offensive, and the officer's weapons are primarily defensive. Because do you know what you need? To be an effective officer, there's one thing that you need above all other things. You need to be alive. And that's one of the underlying facts and themes through this video which you have to get into your head, is that the priority for the whole British Army, but especially for the officer himself, is to keep himself alive so that he can coordinate his men and his men can operate more effectively. If the officer is killed, that knocks out a vital part of the operating structure, the hierarchy, but also just the nuts and bolts, the actual machine of the infantry force. Now let's just focus on that defensive nature for a second. So the sword, most of you will think of this as a weapon, and you'll compare it with other weapons like bayonets and axes and lances and things like this. But fundamentally, this is actually a weapon of defence. It is a weapon that is used for fencing, for defending yourself with. And as I've mentioned in numerous videos in the past actually, one thing that the sword excels at is blocking attacks sent at you. So it doesn't matter if your opponent has got a knife or a bayonet or a sword, but you can defend yourself, certainly in close range, with this, and indeed the pistol. Okay, so this is not an effective firearm to be taking on enemies who are 200, 300, 500 yards away, but this is an effective weapon against someone who's right in front of you and trying to kill you. So fundamentally, the sword and revolver or pistol together are weapons of defence. They're weapons for the officer to defend his own life so that he can be a more effective leader for his men. His men, of course, are armed with the more offensive weapon, the weapon of greater reach and greater offensiveness. This is a weapon which can be used in mass charges going into trenches or indeed across a battlefield. It can defend against cavalry, in theory, with the bayonet, and of course it is a relatively, for the time, rapid fire 10 round magazine bolt action rifle that is accurate out beyond 1,000 yards, beyond the range really that most humans can actually hit a target with. So the rifle is super accurate, super powerful. It's got 10 round magazine, which for the period is really very good, and it's also good in hand-to-hand combat as well. But that being said, when we fixate on hand-to-hand combat, I think we're doing an injustice to the bigger picture and bigger context of what we're actually looking at in warfare here. And actually, if you're jumping into a trench, the person with the bolt-action rifle compared to the person with the sword and the revolver, neither is necessarily at a great advantage over the other, because at the end of the day you have a hand weapon here that you can stab and cut with, and of course parry with and defend with, and you've got a gun which, and bear in mind this is not a real one, incidentally this is a replica, that you can quite rapidly fire off 6 rounds into close targets with. In comparison, if we switch over to the bolt-action rifle, yes, with that first shot, that might be very effective, but at close range, you've now got to cycle that bolt to hit your next target, and this is a long weapon to turn around and shoot at new targets at the same time as loading. The revolver is actually better in close range, and the fact that you've got a thing in each hand means that in theory you can be firing the revolver at the same time as defending yourself, or indeed offending in a different direction with the sword. So this at close range is actually a very good weapon set. This all being said, this is the point I don't want you to focus on. The real point I want you to focus on is that in November 1914, when the British infantry officer had been carrying his sword and wearing his sword for several months of the war so far, he was ordered to put his sword away and swap it instead for a swagger stick or a cane. And the reasons for that are not the reasons that most people seem to assume. So they literally took off their swords, they put them back into base, they put them into storage. In some cases they were, I think, even sent back to Britain, and they no longer wore that sword. They did continue carrying the revolver, but they were no longer wearing that sword and that emblem. And people often assume it's because it was an encumbrance and not an effective weapon. But you'll notice that certainly in some circumstances, when they went on to be involved in things like trench raiding and even some of the more mobile fighting at the end of the war, they did use hand weapons. Officers did use knives, they did use knuckle dusters, entrenching tools, all these kinds of stuff when they needed to as hand weapons. So they got rid of a perfectly good hand weapon, and then they had to replace it with other forms of hand weapon that perhaps were better suited to close-in wrestling range trench fighting, admittedly. But nevertheless, most of their troops were actually armed with a weapon which is not particularly well suited to close-in building or trench fighting, that is a long rifle and long bayonet. So at the end of the day, if they had maintained the sword still could have been used as an effective hand weapon, but they didn't. Now, as I say, most people assume that this is to do with weapon effectiveness, but my assertion, based on some evidence that I'll present to you in a minute, is that that is not the main reason. So what I'm going to assert to you is the main reason that swords were put away in November 1914 is actually represented by this sword here. This sword was actually owned by a young officer whose father and grandfather had served in India in the British Army, and he himself had followed in the family tradition and become an officer in the army. And he'd served for a few years already in the army by this point, out in India, and then war started in 1914 and he found himself in France. And after a few months, I think after a couple of weeks in fact it was, in the field, the officer, the carrier of this sword, who I hasten to point out had extremely well service sharpened their sword. This has very extensive single bevel grind on the edge, and although it's a primarily thrusting sword, it is given some degree of cutting capacity, and it is a Wilkinson patent solid hilt as well. So this is a very good quality sword. It would have cost about twice as much as a standard officer's sword of the time, so he went to great lengths to get a really good sword and have it really well sharpened. So he expected to use this sword in combat, even though he probably didn't, and this particular officer met his end, unfortunately, by being shot in the head. The horrible truth is that at hundreds of yards away, German marksmen could spot out an officer because the officer was waving a sword around. And if you see someone waving a sword around, who is the most effective person to target in that unit? It is the officer. And if you have a Mauser of the time and you're a good shot, you will target that officer and shoot them, and that's what happened. And officers actually suffered a very high attrition rate in the early months of the war. And it's my assertion that the main reason that they put swords away in November 1914 is nothing to do with trench warfare or combat effectiveness or anything else. You'll notice that the cavalry kept their swords, and the cavalry kept using their swords. And as I often mention, the first kill of a British soldier killing a German soldier in World War I was done with a cavalry sword on patrol. So the fact is that swords were still being used to some extent effectively by the cavalry in certain situations, but infantry officers running around on foot waving swords around became very easy targets. And also you'll notice cavalry officers, you can't mark them out from the fact they're waving a sword around, because all of the cavalry are waving a sword around. So infantry officers were particularly easy to target because of their swords. And you'll also notice that not only is a sword a thing which is easy to see from far away, more so than a revolver, for example, which you can't necessarily see from 500 or 800 yards away, but someone waving a sword around that's a shiny, glinty object makes themselves a target, unfortunately. And that's exactly what happens. And British officers were gunned down, were sniped at a very high rate, and they died at per capita at a higher rate than private soldiers. Now you may just be thinking that this is a theory, this is supposition, this is just Matt's idea. But I recently came across a new piece of evidence, courtesy of a friend of mine, and my friend happens to be Major Charles Foynet of the Coldstream Guards. I went to university with Major Charles, and for his whole career he has been in the army. He's a major in the Coldstream Guards now, and he has an interest in military history. He studied archaeology with me, so we have a shared passion for history, and of course we both have a strong interest in military history. And I was talking to him recently about a sword that belonged to a former officer of the Coldstream Guards that it's now come into his possession. So he has it, and it's actually for an officer who died in the Boer War, if you want to be technical, the Second Anglo-Boer War. So the famous Boer War at the end of the 19th century and into the beginning of the 20th. And he's been studying sources related to that conflict, and he actually has records relating to the officer who owned that sword. And he came across this very, very interesting quote, which to me, it's a forerunner to what happened in World War I. And what it shows is that the Coldstream Guards, or the Guards Brigade in general, I think, were told to, their officers were told to put away their swords, just like in World War I. But the reason is given away in this source, and the reason is to do with, and this is implied, it's not explicitly stated, but it's implied, the reason is to do with the Boers sniping officers. The reason we know that is because the context in which this is mentioned, the officers should put away their swords, they actually say they should send the swords back to base. It also says that the men should paint the grips of their bayonets and the scabbards of their bayonets in khaki. So what they're talking about doing is trying to make the soldiers as camouflaged and less snipeable, if that's a word, by the Boers. And of course this is what the Boers were famous for, and indeed we know that the Boers used to target officers when they could. So really what this comes down to is when we look at weapons being replaced or changed or superseded, it's not always purely about combat effectiveness, especially when we're talking about officers' weapons, because an officer's role is to lead his men. And the officer's job is to stay alive so that he can lead his men. That's why the officer's weapons were what they were, because they're defensive weapons for him to protect himself. And indeed, I believe that both in the Boer War and World War I, when officers were told to put away their swords, it was nothing to do with the fact that a stabby object doesn't work anymore, because of course we know stabby objects were used to quite some extent in the First World War, and they had to later improvise trench fighting weapons. What it comes down to is the fact that the sword is an obvious emblem of an officer, and once you have very accurate rifles that can snipe people from hundreds of yards away, sometimes with multiple shots with a magazine as well, then waving a sword around going, "Hello, I'm an officer," is a really, really bad idea. So there you have it. I hope that's been interesting, and I hope it helps you look at this period, and indeed you could apply some of this thinking to other historical periods as well, any period of military history really. But when we're comparing weapons and why one fell out of use and was taken over by a weapon, we have to look at who's using it, why are they using it, where are they using it, who are their opponents, what's happening. We have to look at the full context to understand what's going on. Why did they put those swords away? But in contrast, why did the cavalry keep their swords? And the fact is that swords were still being used in World War I. They were still effective in certain capacities. But if you were an officer of infantry in an age when you had rifles that were accurate out to hundreds of yards, it now became more of a liability to wave a sword around and go, "Come on, men!" When you've got lots of German marksmen over there. It became more of a liability to do that than any possible benefit this might have when you actually get into that trench and start fighting. And as trench weapons show, hand weapons certainly had their place in World War I, but unfortunately what you wanted was a hand weapon like this, which didn't mark you out as a even more attractive target to the enemy than normal. So thanks for watching. Give us a like and a subscribe and share the video if you haven't done already. I've got extra videos on Patreon if you like more of this kind of content, and I'll see you soon on the channel for more videos of this sort. Thanks a lot for watching, folks.